You are listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Chris, and in this episode, we'll take a look at how everything everywhere all at once was suddenly everything everywhere all at once. An indie film made by two men whose crowning achievement at that point was a film about a farting corpse being used as a surfboard had captured the public consciousness in such a way that it was immediately propelled into the conversation of the greatest films of all time. It even held, granted for just a month or so, I believe, maybe a little bit more, the number one spot on the Letterboxd Top 250 feature film list, an honor only bestowed on The Godfather and the current number one Parasite. That's pretty insane, and with the exception of the film I just mentioned, I can't think of any other recent film that has been embraced to this extent by critics and audiences alike. And what's more impressive is that it's an action comedy, two genres that today rarely get their dues. Not to mention that it takes a crack on Marvel's game with its multiverses, and that it intriguingly have Marvel's Russo brothers as producers, with many audiences and critics arguing that it does the multiverse far better. Imagine that, a film about a Chinese immigrant just trying to do her taxes, and a special effects team with no formal training whatsoever had the power to go up against the biggest studio in the world. Did Everything Everywhere All at Once set up a blueprint for how these genres can succeed with critics? Or did it at least open the door for others to think a little bit bigger? And how insane is it that a film that could so easily have become a relatively small cult film with a decent following just exploded in this way? That there's so much to dive into here, from the film references to the humor, including those dildos, the existentialism, its already tremendous stature, and just the hype itself. So before we get into what we thought about Everything Everywhere All at Once, I just wanted to know, how aware were you of the film and the hype when you first saw it? And how worried were you that it would not live up to your expectations? We can probably start with you, Mathieu, because I know that, like me, you saw it for the first time just yesterday.
Yeah, the wait has been long, right? Because it was this very hyped film, and it only came out, I think, a week and a half ago here or something. So yeah, only saw it last night. I guess the hype was worrisome in some ways, but I'm not too affected by it generally. It's not that big a deal, and in the end, I enjoyed it a lot. I mean, it's just a lot of fun, right? I don't know if it's an undeniable masterpiece, but it's certainly a great time.
And what about you, Saul? I think you're the only person here who actually saw it at least a little bit closer to original release. Did you get there before the hype?
Unfortunately, I got there during the hype. So when I first saw the film was in April 2022. So that was during the time when it was number one on Letterboxd, and there was a lot built up to it. I was actually quite aware of the film for quite a few weeks before actually seeing it, because on Letterboxd, in your yearly stats or whatever, has a list of films at the bottom of your stats which have the highest rating that you haven't seen yet. And I guess sometime in March, maybe like February, this film with this really strange poster cropped up on there from the directors of Swiss Army Man. I thought, okay, could be interesting. And then a few weeks later, the news had come out that it had climbed so far on the Letterboxd Top 250 that it was actually the number one film. So when I was going into it thinking, is this the next Parasite? Because, of course, Parasite has for quite a while been the nominal number one on Letterboxd. And I don't know if I was worried about not living up to the hype, but I was curious about it. And I guess at least at first I was a little disappointed. I mean, I loved the film. I was cracking up laughing in the theater. I thought it was very thought-provoking and provocative and extremely interesting. But, then I'm going home and doing my 4-star review, and everybody else is giving it 5-star reviews. And I'm sort of like, it's not actually, quite that amazing. But since then, I actually have rewatched it, decided to specifically watch it again for the podcast. So I bought it on DVD yesterday. I put it in this morning, watched it, and I think I actually liked it even more.
I think I love that description that you saw it, you loved it, it was thought-provoking, it made you laugh, it engaged you, and it was so disappointing. I think that's the issue when you get this amount of hype. And I was trying to come into it with lower expectations. I didn't love Swiss Army Man. It was fun, but it wasn't one of my favorites of the year like it was for some. That film certainly has a cult following. And that could have been the destiny for Everything Everywhere All at Once as well. It has some of the same slightly childish humor. It has dildo fights. It has the awards going up people's behinds. So it could easily have been relegated. But there is something about it that clearly stood out more. And it's certainly far more ambitious. And just like you, I was enjoying it throughout. It's funny, it's action-packed, it keeps you engaged, it has that existentialism there that makes it a bit more interesting. It actually has a bit of a message, even if it, comes into a more bubbly, happy, family-oriented message that it's very approachable, very enjoyable. I mean, it ticks so many boxes. It's huge, it's all-encompassing, it's creative. So I can see why it won so many people over, though my overall estimation is about the same as you. I would also give it a 4 out of 5-star review. So, what about you, Matthew? Are you one of the people who would hold it up as better than 4 stars?
No, but again, I've only seen it yesterday, but no, that's where I'm leaning as well. Ratings like we did an episode on ratings, right? So to me, like anything that's higher than 4 stars, it's something that really engenders a very personal reaction. And, maybe I would have had that reaction if I'd seen it without having the hype, because you have this feeling of discovery. I'm thinking of something, anyway, I can think of other films, like maybe I don't like them as much, but or maybe I don't like them that much more, but because I had that feeling of discovery, it kind of, it makes the film seem even better. And obviously you can't have that with Everything Everywhere All at Once. But yeah, I thought it was great, but I kept comparing it in my mind to The Matrix, which is a huge favorite of mine. And this is a much busier movie, I would say, and I guess that's maybe where, like, its ambition, it's both its strength and its limits in some ways, because it's tackling so many things. It's kind of superimposing a bunch of different ideas over each other, which is really fun, and it works for the most part, but it means that some of it is slightly shallow. So maybe that's my limit with it. But yeah, for the most part, I did love it.
I thought I might just clarify that when I first saw the film, I gave it 4 stars. Upon rewatch today, I've actually bumped it up to 4.5 stars. And yet I still think it's incredibly overrated. So, yeah, so look, I don't think it really deserved the high status it's got at the moment, but look, it's already fallen from currently, as the time of this recording, it's number 12 in Letterboxd in the top 250, and it'll probably fall to 50 or 60, maybe even lower by the time this episode's released. I don't see it maintaining that high position for that long. I think it'll be in the top 100, but I don't think it's going to keep being high up there because more people are coming to see it now who aren't so hyped up, who aren't so interested in fantasy or action. So more, I guess you would call ordinary cinephiles. I don't know if that's the right term for it, but more wider audiences are seeing it now. So I'm not surprised the rating is going down. But look, my own personal rating went up for it. So I actually, do think it's quite amazing. I agree with you thoroughly about the Matrix thing. That's probably what annoyed me the most the first time I saw the film. I kept watching and going, this is so much like the Matrix. I mean, there's a lot of it early on, and there's a part towards the end, which I don't want to spoil, but, it's very similar to what Keanu Reeves does towards the end of the Matrix. I'm sort of like, why are these people not acknowledging this in these 5-star reviews? This is basically a comedy remake of the Matrix. However, I guess what I've come to in my mind is that having a comedy remake of The Matrix actually isn't a really bad launching point. It's actually a pretty solid launching point for an interesting and thought-provoking film.
I think calling it a remake is maybe slightly harsh, but maybe, Chris, you have something about that?
Yeah, I wouldn't go as far as to call it a remake. I would even say it's a direct ripoff. It's clearly inspired, but the concept is very different. I mean, this is not a woman who's, say, living a lie, but realize she's inside of simulation. This is someone who realizes that the multiverse exists, but a lot of the other stuff is very similar. She is the one. Someone has gone through a system to find her, and she's given a choice to pick one of two things. And there's a lot of other similarities to kind of like the ability to download special skills really fast. The concept behind it is different, but it's very similar. And you have this very ordinary person who suddenly becomes a superhero. So there's a lot of parallels. And I agree with Saul that it's a bit odd if it's not pointed out just how similar it is to The Matrix, because those first 20, 30 minutes, there's a lot of overlaps.
Well, yeah, it is mostly in the beginning, right? Especially when her husband, right, first gives her, well, her husband who's not her husband, first gives her that speech about how everything in her world is seeming to be going to shit, or something like that. I don't remember exactly how he says it, but that feels very similar to something that like Morpheus would say to Neo in The Matrix. That being said, about being the one, I think that film is much less interested generally in that idea, right? That's only bandied about by a few characters. I don't think really the film is having the same kind of engagement with the idea of what is the one and the chosen one and all of that kind of narrative tradition as The Matrix is. What The Matrix is almost all about that. I think like Everything Everywhere kind of dispenses with that pretty quickly, especially because there's maybe this is slightly spoilery, but there's a specific reason why she's the main character of this story, and it's not like destiny, right? That's not how I just would describe it anyway.
Yeah, that's fine, and I'll withdraw my remake comment. I think the more accurate word which I used in my review of the film was that it's a reimagining. It's like a comedic reimagination of The Matrix. So yeah, definitely very heavily inspired by it. Does do different things. Definitely, the second half or the second chapter starts to branch off in different ways, and by the end of the film, I actually thought it had more in common with Neon Genesis Evangelion, the end of Evangelion, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and also had a lot in common with Nothing, the film which Vincenzo Natali did about 20 years ago.
I always pronounced it Evangelion, but I have truly no idea. I mean, it's the Japanese making up a nonsense word based on a Greek word, so I think we can pronounce it however we want. Yeah, I'm trying to think. I guess in the sense of like it's kind of going for that mind-blowing thing, but yeah, I didn't really think of Evangelion. I think that's an interesting comparison. I think Evangelion compared to this is much simpler. I mean, not that Evangelion is super simple, but it's all about this adolescence, right? Kind of what differentiates this from The Matrix, among other things, is how bold it is visually, right? The Matrix has this one style and it executes it great. The whole thing about this film is how much it changes, right? Now, it keeps coming back to a few things, but the scenes with the rocks, the scenes with the universe in which people have weird fingers. I guess I'm not going to be more precise than that, just in case. We mentioned Parasite recently. I think one of the things that this film kind of takes from Korean cinema in general is this ability to really jump between genres, to have something be extremely funny and silly and absurd, and then 5 minutes later make it really work emotionally, which is a real challenge for a film that's this busy. And I think that's what makes it work so well, right? It generally manages that difficult balance.
I would agree that Evangelion, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, is a lot more about adolescence in general, but I'm just thinking about the end episode, the last one, the feature film, and in particular, without spoiling it too much, the parts towards the end where it becomes not just animation. There's a lot of stuff going on there, which felt very similar to me to the way that the Daniels were playing with the reality and the fourth wall and everything in this second half of the film, to be as vague as possible to try and avoid putting any spoilers in.
I mean, I think we're going to have to go into spoilers pretty early. I mean, I don't know.
we can try to avoid a little bit longer, but yes, I think we can do light spoilers and ending spoilers, maybe. So we'll have 2 spoiler warnings for those who want to know who the bad guy is. We can do the first spoiler warning, and then when we get close to the ending, we can have that second spoiler warning, because I'm sure a lot of people who haven't even seen it may know some of the early twists. But before that, I think we can dive into a few of the things the film does early, the characters, the other films it's referencing, and a bit more. Just so the people listening and somehow have not given into the hype and have not seen it yet. Because let's remember, you and me, Matthew, we saw it for the first time yesterday. Even us, who watched quite a lot of films, we somehow had not gotten to the point of seeing it yet. So there may be some people listening who have not seen it. One other thing I want to add in there, because we talked about films that it was riffing on and paling in comparison to, and I wouldn't necessarily say it pales in comparison to this, but I would say that I would have been more impressed by Everything Everywhere All at Once if it did not come out 4 years after Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, which was the first major film to really tackle the multiverse, at least the one I can recall. Maybe you guys can remember a couple of other films that were huge blockbusters or at least caught the public attention and did this. But it had a very similar idea, in that you have multiverses with small and big changes, including people's looks, the overall aesthetics, like in Everything Everywhere All at Once. You have a reality where people's hands are made of sausages. You have a reality where everything's just rocks and stones. In Into the Spider-Verse, you had Spider-Man as a pig, you had the black and white Spider-Man, you had completely different animation styles, everything was mixed together, and it always is a little disappointing when, you have that indie film, if you will, that comes out and does something relatively similar to a blockbuster, because it's not usual that the massive blockbuster, does it first.
Yeah, I guess I didn't think at all about Spider-Verse watching this, which is a film I like a lot, right? Spider-Verse. But I think if you want to say that the whole multiverse concept feels less fresh now that it might have before, I think the real big factor is Marvel, right? I mean, I don't know. I guess you don't really watch Marvel movies, Chris, but the last...
I do. I don't.
Okay.
I don't avoid Marvel. I haven't seen Doctor Strange yet, though, but I will.
Yeah, but even actually the latest Spider-Man was also a very multiverse.
Oh yeah, I saw that one. That was very good, actually. I quite enjoyed that.
Just to clarify, I'm the person who avoids Marvel films, which came on one of the other podcasts.
Right.
Yes, I've been mistaken for Saul.
Sorry about that. Yes. So I guess the concept does not feel as fresh anymore, but I would argue that the way Everything Everywhere All at Once tackles it is very different. I don't know. I feel like it's going for a much more philosophical approach. And a much more all-encompassing.
Oh, yes, I agree.
Also, stylistically, even though Spider-Verse is stylistically, accomplished, and it does do a lot with the variations, it does not do as much, it does not try to overwhelm you in the way that this film does, which I think is something that's very successful about Everything Everywhere at Once. But it really gives you something unique, I feel, in that regard.
I completely agree with that. I think that's something we've discussed in our podcast about stressful films as well, and where we also got into hyperactive films, and there's this idea that a lot of indie films from America are actually using this style. We talked about several A24 films, from Uncut Gems to Krisha, and obviously Everything Everywhere All at Once is also an A24 film. That's not to say that it's less original. I think the stressful thing is very interesting. And it also has that kind of energy that we're not used to seeing in major films, in blockbusters, where so much of the suspense, if you will, just comes from how cluttered it is, how much is always going on, and the fact that it's never really stands still. It has a bit of a semi-slow opener where, you set up the family, you get to see their chores, they have some issues with their taxes, there's some small family drama, all of this little setup. But once the film actually gets started, it just goes crazy so fast, and it never really presses that pause button, and you just flip between universes. Like I said earlier, really cluttered, so much going on at the same time, and it's really interesting to see that in a film just of this kind, that is to say an action comedy multiverse bending science fiction film. I'm very happy that this film just dared to do that.
I would say that the opening is already pitched pretty high, right? It's already pretty intense from the start. You have these kind of long shots where we're following Michelle Yeoh and she's dealing with five things at once.
Very, very true, yeah. I mean, this film could have gone a completely different direction. It could just have been a comedy about a woman doing her taxes and getting to terms with her daughter and her husband and her father, and still been probably stressful and fun if they just removed everything else. So you're quite right there, but I am happy it decided to take that detour into full-on sci-fi madness. And I just realized one of the films you might have been thinking about as well earlier, Beyond Infinite 2 Minutes. It doesn't necessarily have that much in common, but it has that stressful, freewheeling concept atmosphere. And that's the first film I kind of thought of earlier when you said that, you feel that there's a sense of discovery. Because I think I like Everything Everywhere All at Once much more than I like Beyond Infinite 2 Minutes. But because the former didn't really have that hype, especially at that time. We just went in blind and, we saw this crazy, creative, low-budget film. It was so easy to get engaged in it. And Everything Everywhere All at Once kind of has that same energy. It has that energy of being the scrappy underdog that gets away with just being so inventive and creative and playful with its fairly limited budget. Because like I mentioned in the intro, the special effects team, they weren't professionals. They had no formal training. They were self-taught. And it was a fairly small team. And the directors are, not traditional, because obviously Swiss Army Man is nothing traditional, but they are indie filmmakers. They did not have that much money going into it compared to the big films. They still managed to just go all the way out and survive on their ingenuity.
So just to backtrack a little bit, because we had the question pop up a few minutes ago of Into the Spider-Verse versus Everything Everywhere All at Once. And I actually think they're very different multiverse films. Like Mature, I wasn't at all reminded of Spider-Verse while watching Everything Everywhere. I think the big key difference is there's a different philosophy between the way the multiverses work. So in Everything Everywhere All at Once, you can't actually meet somebody from the other multiverse. You can become part of their conscious and you can take over their body and you can make them involuntarily do things, but you can't actually interact with them. Whereas Into the Spider-Verse, without spoiling it too much, does actually have interactions between the variations of Spider-Man. Which actually reminds me of what's probably my favorite multiverse film, which is a film called Coherence, which came out around 8 or 9 years ago, which has a bunch of dinner guests suddenly realize that when they go out of their door at night into the blackened streets, when they come back in, they're actually coming back into a different universe. And that one actually does involve them interacting with different versions of themselves, including directly with themselves. So I just think that Everything Everywhere All at Once does it quite differently to Coherence and Into the Spider-Verse, because you don't have that possibility of interacting with person A and person B. If it happens, person B takes over person A and assumes their body instead.
Yeah, I think you're quite right there. I mean, my comment on the Spider-Verse was purely in terms of the way the different universe humor was used, where you had universes with completely different rules and completely different styles. In fact, Into the Spider-Verse probably did that slightly more extremely just because they had the animation to go completely mad with it, though the universe with just rocks was very interesting as well. And apparently there were some universes cut from Everything Everywhere All at Once as well, including one where Michelle Yeoh was apparently a sentient piece of spaghetti, which would have been really fun to see.
I didn't know that. That would have been great. I do wish they had done a bit more wacky universes. I mean, the ones they did.
Yeah, me too.
Were very fun, but even more that have been great. I think what you mentioned here, Saul, is interesting. I guess they're more interested in the psychological approach, not just the philosophical, just even the toll it takes on you to be aware of other universes, right? And to be aware of other yous and to do everything they do in this movie. And you could even see a metaphor. I mean, I think it's probably meant to be there of we live in this very interconnected world where there's this whole idea going around that it's very difficult to live right now because you are constantly prompted by things going around you. I mean, your phone, etc., and just you're aware of everything. And kind of this is like the super extreme version of that. And I think that's one of the things the film does well, is kind of layer a bunch of different ideas that speak to something more mundane around this very high concept idea. I mean, all very good sci-fi films do that, and I think this is an example of it. One other thing I'd like to mention before we jump into spoilers is the action. I was reminded watching this how poor most of the action is in most Hollywood movies. It's not anything that special in this. It's just good martial arts action, right? It's not amazing. It's just quite good. And it's really a reminder of how poor most action scenes are nowadays.
I also just like to go back and just share Saul's recommendation for Coherence, because like him, I would probably put that as my favorite multiverse film as well. It's another one that's on a very small budget, really creative, just a lot of fun with trying to figure out exactly how it all comes together. And just on what Saul said, I completely agree with you that distinction between how pretty much all multiverse films have worked so far, where you can enter another universe and interact with another version of you, and they're completely different versions of you, everything everywhere all at once, change that idea in a pretty fundamental, and I would agree with you, philosophical way, in that they're all essentially you. Like when you jump to universes, you become them. Your consciousnesses merge. You're all part of one entity, if you will. Like if you, and we're probably going to go into spoiler territory very soon, but yeah, the core concept is essentially, if you kind of like open the door to the multiverse in a way, you can become every single you, and all of your consciousnesses can merge in a way. It's a very, very different way of seeing it. It ties in with without spoiling anything, with everything that comes on later as well. So that's just a really fascinating idea. And I'll also just agree with you, Mathieu. The action is good. It's fun. It's playful. It hits all of the key notes about what you kind of expect a kung fu, martial arts, action film to be. But it is play with it so lightly, and you have these little quirks. It really ticks a lot of boxes.
A question I think I'd pose to you guys before we get into spoiler territory is, did you recognize Jamie Lee Curtis? Because I didn't, or at least when I first saw her in the cinema, I didn't recognize her. And it wasn't until the end credits rolled I went, oh. Even rewatching the film this morning, it's actually very hard for me to pick up that it is her. Sometimes when she glances a certain way, I recognize that it's her, but yeah, just completely different. It was just very interesting to see her completely sink into a role that's so polar opposite of what she's known for. She's that iconic tall brunette from A Fish Called Wanda, and here she's this old, overweight, lonely tax agent.
I definitely thought I should recognize the actress, right? During the whole movie, I was like, I definitely know her, but I wasn't able to identify her during the film. I didn't even see the credits. I just saw it like 10 minutes ago before recording this and looking at the credits.
Wow, okay. Well, I recognized her right away, but I also knew she was in the movie before going in, so I'm not sure if that had any impact.
I guess another thing to note that is not really spoilery is I quite like the use of music in this film. I mean, it's essentially two moments that are, well, three in total, I guess, which is the use of Clair de Lune, right? They have this whole section when, not quite the first time we have a fight, right? But essentially the second one, where it's just a bunch of variations on Clair de Lune, and it then reoccurs later in the film in a much more simpler way at a crucial moment. And also, we talked about the references. Well, actually, we didn't talk about it that much, but there's a whole section of the movie that is basically an homage to Wong Kar-wai. Maybe In the Mood for Love specifically, but I think just more generally Wong Kar-wai. And the music is kind of an homage also to the score of In the Mood for Love. And I think just generally the music, it helped going along with kind of the craziness of the movie. I think it was both also going in a bunch of directions and bring it back to something that stayed on theme, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, we can't forget Rakaku either, because early in the film, you have the mother, Michelle Yeoh, our main character, forget the title to Ratatouille and just keep going on about the fact that it's a raccoon, and then she goes into a universe where there is a raccoon controlling a chef. And shockingly, it could have been a one-off joke because it's played so silly, but that segment just keeps coming back as well, even getting a little bit degree of emotional poignance, which I have not expected at all. So I really love this idea of how it just kept stringing its various multiverses along, and maybe that's also why the sentient spaghetti was cut off, because it just couldn't have that many multiverse settings returning. But yeah, I think it's time we probably go into a little bit of spoiler territory, because some of these twists come fairly early. So if you haven't seen the film at all, you might want to just leave the podcast right now, see the film, and return later, because there is one fairly big early twist.
Spoiler warning.
Which ties in with probably the film's core message of family, because the reason why Michelle Yeoh's character of Evelyn Wang is so important is that in one of the many multiverses, she is a character who essentially discovered the multiverse, found out how to break through this barrier. And we also realized that her, shall we say, mothering and pressure broke her daughter and turned her into the film's almost invincible supervillain who has mastered the multiverse, has channeled every single fighting style and almost magical skill known to man, and can flip multiverse dimensions in a second, leading to some pretty insane and crazy, colorful and twisted fights. And the central dilemma of the film really quickly becomes about whether or not Evelyn should kill her daughter in her own dimension just to stop this being from another world to be able to leap into this universe, or if she should find another way to defeat her, or perhaps even convince her to come back to the good side with love, if you will. There's a lot of, shall we say, existentialism coming in here too, with our villain's motives. What essentially drove her over the brink is seeing all of the universes, coming to the conclusion that since everything is random, all of these universes having changes just because of a split-second decision, nothing means anything anymore. And this is actually one of the film's core themes of trying to deal with and overcoming, and probably one of the things that means the most to the people viewing it as well. It's the most poignant part of the film, if you will, even if it is perhaps handled, like Matthew said earlier, that some of the parts may be a little bit shallow, but that is something that also separates it quite a lot from the big Marvel action films, at the very least. How did you guys react to the twists, the fights, the teams, and just everything? Just I'll give you a free-for-all and just jump in on the part that mattered the most to you here.
Well, I actually would think that the last thing you mentioned, right, the whole idea of not falling for nihilism, that is to me the core of the movie. That's not one of the things that I think is a little shallow. I'd argue actually the family aspect is maybe the one that's more there, but I don't think of it as being the key of the movie, even though, yeah, I think maybe some other people will see it and feel that way. I guess maybe just I'm more interested in the whole idea, which is present in sci-fi quite a lot. At least the resolution is quite present, which is this idea that skepticism, right? Or it's not skepticism here. It's more like sudden awareness is kind of leading you to this nothing matters kind of destructive tendency. And that the way that you get out of that is essentially the power of love, right? I mean, it is such a cliche in sci-fi for a reason, right? It is. It keeps coming back, because when you want to come back to the roots, come back to something simple, something that roots you, to that makes you care, I mean, it's going to be some variation on that. I mean, this film never quite uses that vocabulary, because it's in this idea of the specific connection mother-daughter, and also with her husband. I mean, her husband is literally what makes her open her third eye, which I think is great. Using that opening your third eye imagery is with the googly eye is like a perfect encapsulation of the kind of mix of silly comedy and pretty well thought out philosophy in the film. I think that part actually is what I like the most about the film, how that generally worked quite well.
Completely agree with that. I think it's also interesting that, you said the family is the most shallow element here. And we spent about half an hour talking about the film and we barely mentioned the family and the drama, which is where we kind of start off with the film. The husband is considering divorce. Her daughter is dating a woman and Evelyn is very uncomfortable about this, especially towards her aging father, who she's afraid will be a bit of a bigot. The father has always been, this imposing figure on her. Do you have Evelyn and her relationship with her husband, father, daughter, which is very central, but that's not what we focused on at all. We focused on the multiverses, we focused on the comedy, we focused on the various references, the craziness, and now we're focusing on the philosophy. And I do actually agree that, Mathieu, that while it is very overused in sci-fi, I actually think that the way it tackled it, even if it might be similar to some other films, it's quite beautiful. It is quite powerful for what it is, what it says, and it's kind of cure to nihilism. So that is definitely one of the core strengths of Everything Everywhere All at Once.
And to be fair to the whole family aspect, it's also possible that we didn't talk about it that much because as cinephiles, or at least as people who watch so many movies, we tend to focus on the form more, I think, than quote-unquote regular people. I'm sure there are plenty of people who see this movie and, would mostly think of the emotional aspect and then go, well, it also goes a bit crazy, but that kind of is that anchor that really makes the film work for them. So I think that might be an aspect also. It's what we look for personally.
I would agree that love is a big part of Everything Everywhere All at Once. I would also agree that it's a bit of a cliche and it's like another factor which reminds me of The Matrix because, that's like number one weakness of The Matrix is that it all comes down to the power of love, which I think is a bit of a weak way of coming down on things. But look, it is handled quite nicely in Everything Everywhere All at Once because it's not so much about love as such, it's more about kindness and being nice to people, which is what the husband is all about, is what she learns to do in the end. And when she decides to fight everybody at the end and stop bullets, she turns the bullets into the googly eyes and throws them back at people. Everybody comes and attacks, so she changes something into something nice. So she doesn't actually physically fight them, she fights something nice, like she turns a grenade into a perfume spray and so on. So I think that's quite an interesting and positive message. And of course, you have the stuff with Deidre, the Jamie Lee Curtis character, and being nice to her and the nice relationship that they're able to have. So I think a lot of it probably more about just being a decent human being towards other people. I think that's what a lot of the film is getting at. If you're decent to other people, if you're kind towards them, if you show compassion, that's probably the best way through rather than being, true love conquers all type of thing, which is what The Matrix is about. So it deviates from it a little bit, but, that bullet stuff turning into eyes at the end, I guess that was another, I wouldn't say nail in the coffin, but it was just another final reminder to me of how much of a reimagination the film does feel of The Matrix.
Yes, I was thinking the same thing when that fight scene happened. But I also agree with you that this focus on it's not just love, it's also kindness, and this idea that kindness can overcome so much. It's a very sweet touch. It's a big change from a lot of other movies of its kind. And I think that also ties in with how it tackled Jamie Lee Curtis's character, because early on, and she's essentially just this henchwoman, if you will. She's at the tax office, she's this foil or this antagonist that, might give them a fine. Then she gets possessed, if you will, by this creature by this other personality of hers from the so-called Alphaverse, and becomes, a crazed killer. Very little emotion, very little of anything else. That first fight scene could have been the last, or she could have just been someone walking in the background doing a few fights throughout the film. But Instead, her character and her character from different multiverses are given a lot of added agency. We get a little bit extra backstory. We get bonding moments. She's a fairly large part of the ending as well. So that was not a very surprising choice for me to just let a character that could have been this insignificant henchwoman suddenly develop into someone very human and have several human moments throughout the film.
I thought it's also interesting to note with the Jamie Lee Curtis character that the first thing that first allows Evelyn to jump universes is being unpredictably saying and meaning it, saying to her, I love you. So that act of kindness from the very start is the first thing that actually helps her with the universe jumping. So I guess it just further presses the film's message that, being kind to people is sort of the best way to get through the crazy multiverse universe in which we possibly live.
It does, but doesn't she cheat on that? Doesn't she say "I love you" kind of to her husband? And I don't. You've seen it even more recently than I have. But doesn't she kind of get around it like that?
No, not to my memory from a few hours ago. There's a point where she's putting like her fingers up as a cross or whatever as she's saying it. But then later on, we've got the point where Jamie Lee Curtis is jumping down the staircase. Her knee is out, about to hit her in the face. And she sort of puts her hands together and sort of prays and says, I love you. And the thing swirls around and she presses the button. And that starts off her whole journey. So I think she did actually intentionally mean it or manage to get it as intentional as she could. So I just think it's interesting that kindness starts off the journey as well as helps, repair everything at the end.
Yeah, I guess I don't know that I really buy it for her character at that point, but I guess it has to happen. I do think the idea of like doing something really unpredictable is going to give you powers that is obviously comedic gold. And, it's the first time we see it, right, with her husband when he eats the rouge, right? How do you call it in English, right? The
lip balm.
When he eats that's just a great moment, right? They really milk it too. They make it this really big dramatic moment. It's pretty hilarious, and they do manage to use that very well, right? It really works well with their comedic sensibilities, right? I haven't seen Swiss Army Man. I'm just aware of what that movie is, and yeah, a lot of scenes in this have this pretty unique sense of humor that I think they managed to kind of get in there quite well. Which I would say the highlight comedically for me was the scene with the rocks, the use of the subtitles there, like especially when the rocks are laughing. I thought that was pretty amazing.
Yeah, I was gonna linger on the fights and insanity for a little bit longer, but yes, I think the highlight of the film for me too were the rocks, especially when the rocks have those little googly eyes on them.
Yeah.
But the subtitles too, that's so bloody creative. And that might also tie back to how we focus so much on form sometimes, because obviously that is the most different in terms of form. It specifically uses subtitles as dialogue, etc. So it's interesting that's what we single out. But just to get back to the comedy for a second here, some of the big comedic standouts comes from the concept that you have to do something you would never otherwise do to be able to leap into another universe / down those skills from that universe. And, when you have some of those fights with the villains and you immediately see them run to do something bizarre, like that large fight scene with 5-6 people in the office. So one person jumps on the table, one person eats something, another person starts humping the wall just to start getting everything started. Then you have that weird fight where they're told what they need to do in order to download, and is to stick a trophy up their ass. You see this big security guard trying to run and to power jump onto this trophy. It's absolutely insane. It's very silly, a bit childish, obviously, as well. But even though you haven't seen it, Matthew, you're spot on with saying that this is exactly the type of craziness that you could expect from the people who made Swiss Army Man.
In terms of the comedy for me, I guess I did find the whole jumping on trophies thing very juvenile. And same with the dildos. I mean, those parts still, when I was rewatching it, I was rolling my eyes a little bit. The lip balm stuff is hilarious, and I was probably laughing the most at that this time. Just the way they're all like reacting as he's getting it out of the little fanny pack or whatever. They're like, oh, don't do that or whatever. They're acting as if it's a weapon, and it's just a lip balm, and it just goes completely bonkers from there. What made me laugh both this time and last time through was the part with Big Nose Lady and the dog and flinging the dog around the room. And there's a part where she like flings it across and Evelyn cuts the cord and just flies off. And I know that's cruelty to animals and it didn't really happen. It's just, CGI and whatever, but that part's just hysterically funny. And part that had me laughing the most was the Ratatouille part because I knew nothing about the Ratatouille stuff going into the film, so it was all a big surprise. And I just thought it was hilarious whenever you saw the Ratatouille character or whatever, and the guy going Ratatouille, I learnt so much from you, oh no, and like pulling off and seeing the raccoon in his head. I mean, all of that was absolutely hilarious. The first time around, second time around, I didn't quite find it quite as funny. It's definitely quite amusing. It was definitely very funny hearing her explain the movie though again to her daughter and the daughter and her husband like cracking up because they know that it's not actually Ratatouille, it's Ratatouille. Parts which I found were funny did vary a little bit this time, but definitely some things like the dog being flung across the room were equally as funny for me this time as they were the first time round. And the more juvenile stuff for me was still juvenile. I mean, it's probably why it's not 5 stars for me yet. At least. I just find a lot of it is very silly, especially with all the randomness and the crazy random things in there. But, I definitely did have a good time with it.
For me, too, that some of the juvenile stuff is part of why it's slightly low for me. I also think that, like I mentioned earlier, the family stuff, while good and it does the job perfectly, it is not the standout of the film. It's just solid and it's expected. So those are some of the things that kind of stops it from being a favorite for me. But I'd be very interesting though, because obviously it went up to 4.5 for you. So what would you say is the biggest difference between the first and your second viewing? Like what was it that propelled it into that kind of favorite status?
I think a lot of it came down to watching the film, knowing what was going to happen. There's quite a few interesting hints which I didn't sort of like pick up the first time around. Like we see a woman who's flicking that big, advertising sign around on the street. There's somebody like that outside the taxation building before they go in there the first time. So a few small things like that. But I guess just a lot of it was maybe watching it without the hype in there. I mean, I was able to better concentrate on what was going on. I mean, the first time around, even though I was enjoying it and laughing my head off in the theatre, I was saying to myself, why aren't people picking up on the Matrix stuff? Why aren't people calling this film out for borrowing a lot of stuff rather than doing its own thing? Whereas I guess the second time around, I was better able to sit back and sort of enjoy it because I sort of knew where it was heading. I wasn't expecting it to do anything revolutionary. I guess what I was entering into the second time, sort of knowing where I was going, I was expecting a slightly comedic variation of the Matrix, which it is, and which it does do really well. Yeah, I mean, I guess we could do a whole podcast about hype, but that's probably maybe the main thing, which was the factor for me. I mean, there were the little things in there which I missed, some of those little cues in there, but a lot of it was just, being able to just enjoy the ride, knowing where it's heading, rather than going into it with the mindset of, is this really going to be the best film of all time?
Yeah, I guess being a huge fan of Tarantino, I will never start criticizing the movie for wearing its influences on its sleeve. Like, I think, yes, this owes a lot to the Matrix, but I don't see that as any kind of a negative. Regarding the humor, just to go back a little bit, I do think generally the jokes are very funny the first time. When they come back to it the second time, it's still quite funny. It's when they come back to it more, then it starts being less funny to me, like Ratatouille. I don't know. I don't remember Hakun Ui or something. Joke is less funny the third, fourth, and fifth time. It's kind of the same with like the sausage fingers. It's absolutely hilarious the first time, but after a while, and what they do is they manage to make it slightly more emotionally resonant with still being very silly. It kind of works. It doesn't always work that well. I think some of the best humor is like really the one-shot stuff, like the 2001 reference to explain the sausage fingers. Yeah, that got a huge laugh in my theater, at least. So yeah, I think they could have been even better with the comedy by doing more different things, right? But at the same time, they have that balance to keep. So I don't know if more one-off jokes would have been even better. So Saul asked if it's still showing theatrically in France. It only came out a week and a half ago. That's why I only saw it yesterday. It came out in late August.
Oh, wow, that's absolutely incredible. I can't imagine, I guess, what it would be like, watching it, having all this hype ever since about late February, early March, having all this hype and having to wait that long to sit down for it. I mean, I complained in Australia because the Jordan Peele film Nope, we had to wait 3 weeks after the rest of the world to see it. And I'm sort of like, we're in 2022. Why do you have to wait 3 weeks after America for people to actually release it here? But yeah, obviously that's nothing compared to what you've had to go through with this film.
Yeah, Nope also came out in late August, which I think is quite a bit later than it came out in the US. I still haven't seen it because I was in vacation. I'm seeing it this weekend. Anyway, that's not really for the podcast.
Yeah, that's like Herds fun. We might have Nope at another podcast, or maybe it'll come up in the best of 2022 podcast if I don't see better films between now and then.
Will Everything Everywhere All at Once make an appearance in our best film of 2022 podcast?
If we did it right now, it certainly would. It very well might. I'm not sure.
With it being bumped up to a 9, and given how few 9s I hand out, especially the first time viewings, it's probably going to end up being there. I don't know if it'll be number 1 because I've already got another 2022 film that I want to rewatch, which I think will go up to a 9 out of 10. So I don't think it would be my number 1 going to the podcast, but it will probably be hard for me to find other films that I'd rate as highly as that. But we'll find out. All in good time.
So Everything Everywhere All at Once has a pretty good degree of an endorsement. And I don't think it will make my list because it's only an 8 for me. And usually I have a better year than that for my top 5 and 10. But let's see. I think this might be a good time to just get into the actual ending of it as well. If you're one of those people who went past the spoiler warning but don't want us to spoil the actual ending, you can probably leave now. But we already dropped quite a lot of hints already. We hinted that it would end with kindness. We hinted that it would end with love. We haven't really gotten that much into the mother-daughter relationship yet, which probably goes back to, once again, what we talked about a little bit earlier with Foreman, also the fact that the relationship might be a little bit conventional. But as we said, you have this daughter who essentially become all powerful, can connect all dimensions, and we realize that this bagel, another example of silliness that we brought up earlier, is not created to destroy the world, it's created to destroy her. And the reason why she's been trying to reach out to her mother is so she can actually have someone understand how she feels, possibly join her, but secretly also try to be convinced not to go through this, black bagel. So, as we all know, and as everyone who has seen the film know, after a long emotional fight where Evelyn essentially makes all of the henchmen step down with kindness, using different realities to turn, like you said, a grenade into a perfume that reminded one person of his deceased wife, and lots of other fairly sweet gestures. The daughter is still not convinced. She tries to still go through the bagel. Evelyn tries to stop her. Waymond, her husband, gets involved. Even the grandfather, who in this Alpha universe has been this essentially kind of mastermind behind the resistance, been trying to convince Evelyn to indeed kill her daughter, gets involved. They all grab her and try to drag her out of the bagel with obviously this emotional music. It is one of the most overt moments of sentimentality. This is essentially the moment when you clash in with the existentialism and joy somehow throughout, because while this is happening, we switch to so many other multiverses, including an emotional fight in a parking lot. And she somehow gets convinced that this simple thing, this family, these small joys make life worth living and going on. I mean, it's the message against nihilism. It's the message that it's the little things that's important, even if things are random, essentially, even if you feel small in the universe, even if more discoveries might make us feel smaller, we still have small joys, we still have family, we still have loved ones, we still have the little things. As even Wayman says in the in the mood for love universe, if you will. If he had a chance to be with Evelyn in another universe, just do taxes, he'd be happy. And whereas Evelyn tells her daughter Joy in the parking lot that there's nowhere else he would rather be than right there with her right then. Very sentimental, very obvious, but it gets the message across, and we actually get an ending where she decides to stay. We go into one of the universes where the family has a fairly normal life, and that's it. That's what we're left with, this message of connection. So how did you guys react to that ending?
I kind of expected it to be something like that, and I think it worked quite well. I think the whole action scene where she turns stuff into things people love, right, is a nice illustration of that concept, which is again not a new concept, but the way it's illustrated here is pretty creative. So I like that quite a bit. I was a bit puzzled, but maybe this is a bit sideways, but by the chapters in the film. Right? I think the first two made sense, right? Everything and everywhere. But I'm not sure All at Once really works as a title for the kind of epilogue we get. But yeah, I like the ending. It was about what I expected and done well.
I actually agree with Mature about the title of the third episode, The All at Once. It's the shortest chapter by far, and yet it's what you would kind of think would be the most interesting, being able to master everything all at once. In terms of the actual ending, the final thing with her sitting there, listening to the taxation agent and zoning out and going, pardon or whatever, I missed what you said. I actually predicted that when I saw that in cinema. Like, I'm watching that scene going, she's going to turn around and say that she wasn't listening. So I sort of predicted it, but, it is still a nice ending, and I guess it concludes the film quite well. It's not maybe a standout, highly memorable ending for me. I think it's a good conclusion, but I guess ultimately, I would have liked a little bit more on the All at Once, or something a little bit, maybe a bit more adventurous with that in there.
And I've also seen some critique of the ending with people being a bit frustrated that we end on a different version of the family than the one we essentially follow, because this is the family that we kind of get to mid-film, which kind of kept going on with the day, if you will, where everything kind of still stayed relatively normal. And this is the one where you have all of the major conflict resolutions. While in the first version of the multiverse, we get into that we kind of leave with the big fight. My kind of semi-take on this is that the fact that it uses all at once for its ending is that they're all the same people. That's kind of been the message throughout the film, that everyone's there, everyone in all the universes, and at that point, Evelyn has made connections with everyone everywhere, with every version of herself everywhere. So has her daughter, quite possibly Waymond and the grandfather herself, who knows. But I think it's kind of this idea that they are everyone everywhere, especially Evelyn. So I think that's kind of the meaning of that ending. But yeah, I do agree that I would probably have expected a little bit more from that title because, like Sol says, it is the most interesting title, if you will.
I actually didn't realize that it wasn't the same timeline as the when we begin with. Where does this one diverge?
Well, it's a different reality, essentially. But this that reality at the end is one where they just left the tax office. They didn't get into a fight there.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Yes, and she does not file the paperwork by 6, like David Lee Curtis' character that had told her, and they come and they try to seize the shop. That's kind of the timeline we're left with.
I'll admit that I did not really understand the tax issue. I kind of figured, okay, it's a MacGuffin, essentially. I didn't really understand what they needed to do and exactly how this was supposed to be resolved.
Well, essentially, let's not make this into the straight story where we go into a large tangent about possible regulations. But she had essentially claimed lots of things to get a lower tax than they should have. So she had claimed essentially everything.
Yeah, everywhere all at once.
All of her hobbies, all of the things to buy, karaoke machines, food, everything. Like food, she was pretending to be a chef, so they wrote it off. That kind of thing. And of course, interestingly, in the parallel multiverses, she, for instance, was a chef, she was a singer, and so on. Yeah. So that's a very fun little note as well.
Yeah, I got that. I just didn't get exactly how this was supposed to be resolved. I guess by resubmitting. I suppose I get it. Anyway, this was the tax corner.
Yeah, I've done this plan within 5 to 10 minutes, like we did on lawnmower laws in the US. So we're getting better at keeping it down.
Appropriate for this film that we are kind of going all over the place.
Oh yes, absolutely. I think it's beautiful. The more all over the place it can be, the better. Do you have anything you would like to add, Saul, that's a bit all over the place?
I think Saul has gone into the bagel, so we've lost him.
It's okay. I am here. I'm not sure what else to really add at this point. Yeah, there's a lot to the film. I think we've covered probably a fair snapshot of it, but yeah, there's a lot going on. So we could have a 5-hour podcast about all different various things in the film, but there's definitely a lot to dig into, which I guess is one of the reasons why so many people are liking it and logging in on Letterboxd and rewatching it, because there's all different aspects of it which you could get into, from the philosophical to the family stuff to the film being apparently a satire about how hard it is to do your taxes. No, this is what some of the first comments were saying on Letterboxd, the highest rated ones. I too have trouble doing my taxes, and the whole film's meant to be, about that, about commenting how tricky taxes are and how complicated it is. It is as if you're part of a multiverse. So lots of stuff to dig into. Nothing else really springing to mind at the moment, but obviously, if something else does come up, the thread that will be created for this on the forum will be a great place to discuss it.
Oh yes, if anyone has any crazy fan theories, please drop in with those as well, because I just got one from Saul where perhaps Evelyn just got lost in her own thoughts, fading out at the tax office. Imagine the whole film and the ending is just the tax office ending. Everything else was in her mind. Who knows?
I love it, Chris. That's an amazing interpretation.
And with that, and with the call to action to just drop in your interpretations, your thoughts, especially because we really couldn't be able to cover everything about everything everywhere all at once, simply because there's so much to cover. Drop us a comment in the thread dedicated to this episode and let us know what we missed, your thoughts, your interpretations, what moved you, and if we're just completely heartless for not fully being invested in the family, the characters, and their internal drama. So until next time, thank you so much for listening, and join us again soon. You have been listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com.